February 14th, 1945, a frozen road somewhere in eastern France. An American military ambulance sits dead in the snow, engine running on fumes, then silence. Inside, 23 wounded soldiers, some unconscious, some screaming. One man, Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston, who survived 3 gunshot wounds in combat, is bleeding through his bandages, his body temperature dropping, his eyes going glassy. The driver jumps out, checks the fuel gauge. Empty. He radios for emergency resupply. The reply comes back, no fuel available at this sector. O'Brien dies 6 hours later. Not from his wounds, from a fuel shortage. And here is what makes that death unforgivable, 2 miles from where that ambulance sat frozen. American Army warehouses were packed floor to ceiling with fuel, food, medicine, and ammunition. Those warehouses were full. The supplies existed. They simply never arrived because 3 American quartermaster sergeants had already sold them to French civilians for cash. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of this community of history lovers who believe that the past has the power to change how we see the present. This is the story of what happened when General George S. Patton found out. And what he did next was so ruthless, so publicly devastating, so legally aggressive, that military historians are still debating it 80 years later. By the time this investigation was finished, 43 officers would be convicted, over 100 enlisted men dishonorably discharged, and $3.8 million in stolen supplies would be traced, recovered, and redistributed. Black market activity in Third Army's operational area would drop by 90% in a single month. But before any of that happened, one man had to die in an ambulance on a frozen road so that a general with ice blue eyes and a volcanic temper would finally have the evidence he needed to burn the entire corrupt network to the ground. The winter of 1944 into 1945 was the coldest in European memory. Soldiers on the front lines of Patton's Third Army were fighting in temperatures that dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. They were wearing inadequate boots, eating cold rations when rations arrived at all, and watching their wounded comrades wait hours for medical attention because supply convoys were chronically, inexplicably, mysteriously running short of everything they needed. On paper, the supply situation looked adequate. Requisition records showed steady delivery rates. Inventory logs at the depots showed normal levels. But on the front lines, reality told a completely different story. Supply shortages had increased by 40% over 4 months, while the official paperwork showed no disruption whatsoever. That mathematical impossibility had been noticed by a handful of junior officers who made the mistake of asking questions, and every single one of them had been quietly transferred to other assignments before those questions could become formal complaints. Private Danny Russo from Brooklyn had been in the same foxhole for 11 days. He was 22 years old, barely old enough to shave, and he hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days. His K rations ran out on day 9. The resupply convoy that was supposed to arrive on day 10 never came. He sat in that frozen hole in the ground with his rifle across his knees, his stomach cramping so hard it bent him forward, trying to stay alert enough to watch the German positions 200 yards across a snow-covered field. Behind him, 200 yards in the other direction, sat a supply depot warehouse containing crates of canned meat, boxes of chocolate bars, sacks of coffee, cartons of cigarettes, and enough fuel to power a tank division for a week. Russo didn't know that warehouse existed. If he had, he also wouldn't have known that the men running it had already sold most of its contents to civilians in 3 different countries. The black market network operating inside Patton's Third Army supply chain was not a collection of opportunistic individuals helping themselves to a few extra cigarettes. It was an organized criminal enterprise. It had structure, hierarchy, distribution networks, financial arrangements, and protection from officers high enough in the chain of command that anyone who stumbled across evidence of it quickly discovered that the evidence had a way of disappearing along with their career prospects. At its center was a web of quartermaster officers who had recognized very early in the campaign that the chaos of wartime logistics created gaps in accountability large enough to drive a truck through. Literally, Army trucks loaded with stolen supplies were being driven out of depots at night, transported to prearranged locations, and unloaded into the hands of French black market dealers, German collaborators, and civilians in occupied territory who would pay extraordinary prices for American goods that were simultaneously supposed to be feeding American soldiers. Corporal Thomas Martinez had noticed something wrong 8 months before Patton's investigation began. Martinez was 23 years old, the son of a schoolteacher from San Antonio, Texas, and he worked as a supply clerk at a depot near the German border. He was not a hero in any movie sense of the word. He was quiet, methodical, careful with numbers, and deeply uncomfortable with confrontation. When he first noticed discrepancies between incoming shipments and distribution records, he assumed it was a counting error. When the discrepancies kept appearing week after week, with a pattern too consistent to be accidental, he brought his concerns to his immediate superior. His superior told him to mind his own business. When he went one level higher, he was called into a meeting with 2 officers he had never seen before, who informed him that making false accusations against superior officers was a court-martial offense, and that his service record was about to become very interesting if he didn't learn to focus on his assigned duties and stop asking questions that were above his pay grade. Martinez went home to his bunk that night and made a decision that took more genuine courage than anything he would ever do with a weapon. He began keeping his own records. In a small notebook he carried in his breast pocket, he wrote down dates, quantities, names, and transactions. Every shipment that arrived and disappeared without reaching distribution. Every night when trucks left the depot in directions that had nothing to do with frontline positions. Every name he heard mentioned in connection with the diversion of supplies. Every officer he observed signing paperwork that he knew from his own records couldn't possibly reflect actual deliveries. For 8 months, Martinez wrote it all down carefully, quietly in handwriting so small it could fit 6 months of criminal evidence in 60 pages. He was waiting, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what he was waiting for. He was waiting for someone to care enough to actually do something. He had no way of knowing that the event that would finally bring that person was happening 2 miles away from where he was writing his notes in a frozen ambulance on a road he would never travel. The incident report from the February 14th medical convoy reached General George S. Patton's desk the following morning. His aide, who had delivered a great many unpleasant reports to a great many generals over the course of this war, noted afterward that he had never seen a man read a document twice in complete silence and then smile the way Patton smiled. It was not a smile of satisfaction. It was not a smile of anger, though there was plenty of that beneath it. It was the specific, controlled smile of a man who had just identified exactly the target he had been looking for and was already calculating the most efficient way to destroy it completely. Patton had been aware that something was wrong with his supply chain for months. He had noticed the same mathematical impossibility in the supply reports that had bothered the junior officers who were subsequently transferred for noticing it. But suspicion without evidence is worthless in a command structure, and every time he had pushed for investigation, the logistics chain had produced paperwork that made the discrepancies look like administrative errors rather than deliberate theft. The incident report from the February 14th convoy was different. It came with an attached investigation that had been initiated at the field hospital level and had already gathered testimony from medics, drivers, and wounded soldiers before anyone in the logistics command had a chance to bury it. It had names, it had dates, it had statements from enlisted men who had watched supplies disappear and been told to keep quiet about what they saw. Patton put the report down on his desk, looked at the window for approximately 4 seconds, and then spoke to his aide in a voice that everyone in the room would later describe as very, very quiet. "Get me the Inspector General. Get me the Provost Marshal. Get me the JAG office. And get me the commander of every supply depot in the Third Army. I want them all here in 2 hours, non-negotiable." His chief of staff suggested carefully that some of those commanders had significant connections and that perhaps a more measured approach through proper channels might be advisable. Patton turned and looked at him. You think I'm going to give these men time to cover their tracks? It was not a question. The Chief of Staff said nothing further. What Patton assembled in the next 2 hours would later be described by participants as the most terrifying meeting they ever attended during the entire war, and these were men who had participated in actual combat operations. The supply depot commanders arrived expecting a reprimand, a reorganization briefing, perhaps a discussion of new accounting procedures. They found instead a room containing military police legal officers, criminal investigation division agents, and a general who was standing at the head of a conference table with the stillness of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was simply waiting for everyone to sit down before he did it. Patton did not open with pleasantries. "Gentlemen," he said, "I'm going to ask you a simple question. I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are any of you aware of supply theft, black market sales, or the diversion of materials meant for combat troops?" The room was silent. One colonel, a man named Peterson, who commanded a major depot near the German border, began a sentence about minor accounting irregularities in operations of this scale. Patton repeated the phrase, "minor irregularities," back to him at a volume barely above a whisper. Then he described what happened to Sergeant Michael O'Brien in the ambulance. He described Private Danny Russo in the foxhole. He dropped a folder on the table with a sound like a rifle shot. "I have documented cases of food, medicine, fuel, and ammunition being diverted and sold. I have testimony from enlisted men who tried to report this and were silenced. And I have reason to believe that some of you in this room are either directly involved or knowingly turned a blind eye." He paused. "The MPs behind you are going to escort each of you to separate rooms. You are going to provide complete accounting of every supply shipment under your command for the last 6 months. Your financial records are being subpoenaed as we speak, and if I find one piece of evidence that you participated in, profited from, or ignored supply theft, I will personally ensure that you spend the rest of your life breaking rocks in a military prison." Colonel Peterson stood up and mentioned his congressional connections. What happened next became the moment that every person in that room would describe in different ways for the rest of their lives. Patton moved around the table faster than seemed possible, placed himself directly in Peterson's face, and spoke at a volume that required Peterson to focus completely to hear the words. "Do you have friends in Washington?" "Let me tell you what I have, Colonel. I have American soldiers dying in foxholes. I have men bleeding because the supplies meant to support them were sold for your personal profit. Call every friend you have in Washington. And when you get them on the phone, explain to them why Sergeant Michael O'Brien is dead." Peterson sat down. He would not stand up of his own choice again until his sentencing hearing. The raids began at 0300 hours, simultaneous. Every supply depot in the Third Army hit at the same moment by MPS and CID agents who had spent 6 hours being briefed on exactly what they were looking for. Shocked quartermaster personnel were pulled from their bunks. Personal quarters were searched. Financial records were seized. Inventory logs were cross-referenced against distribution receipts in real time. At Peterson's depot alone, investigators found that over 40% of incoming supplies had been systematically diverted. False inventory records. Forged distribution receipts. A Swiss bank account containing $180,000. At a depot near Nancy, they found Major Richard Blackwell, who had constructed something that was no longer theft in any ordinary sense, but an organized criminal enterprise, spanning 3 countries with French dealers, corrupt local officials, and German civilian buyers, all documented in a personal ledger written in Blackwell's own handwriting. And then a CID agent, interviewing supply clerks at the Nancy depot, sat down across from a quiet young corporal from San Antonio, who reached into his breast pocket and produced a small notebook. Thomas Martinez placed 60 pages of handwritten evidence on the table and said simply that he had been waiting for 8 months for someone to care enough to do something about what he had been watching happen. By the time the sun rose on February 16, 1945, Patton had over 40 officers in custody. He had evidence of theft totaling millions of dollars. He had the names of participants from private to lieutenant colonel. And he had the notebook of one 23-year-old supply clerk who had decided that integrity was worth more than safety, and had written down every single thing he saw. The investigation was just beginning. But already in frozen foxholes across the front lines of eastern France, the first resupply convoys were moving again, loaded with everything that should have arrived weeks ago, heading toward soldiers who had been waiting and starving and dying, while American officers counted their money. The corruption was exposed. The network was broken open. But what Patton was going to do to the men responsible, the trials, the sentences, the punishment, that went beyond anything the law technically required. The decision to send convicted officers to the front lines before their court-martial so they could sit in the exact same foxholes they had stolen from that story was only beginning. And when you hear what happened to Colonel Peterson during those 3 days in a frozen foxhole, when you understand what broke him and what he said to the combat sergeant sharing that hole in the ground, you will understand something about human conscience that no courtroom testimony could ever teach. In Part 2, we go into that foxhole, and nothing will be the same afterward. In Part 1, we watched Patton assemble his investigation team, raid every supply depot in the Third Army simultaneously, and pull 40 officers out of their comfortable billets at 3 in the morning, with evidence of $3.8 million in stolen supplies. Corporal Thomas Martinez handed over his notebook. Colonel Peterson's Swiss bank account was frozen. Major Blackwell's three-country criminal enterprise was exposed. The network was broken open. But breaking it open and destroying it were two very different things. Because now Patton had to do something that no general in the history of this war had successfully done: prosecute senior officers with political connections in the middle of an active campaign, without the investigation being buried by the very institutional machinery that had protected the theft for months. And here is the number that tells you exactly how difficult that was going to be. Of the 43 officers Patton had in custody, 11 of them had direct connections to general officers at SHAEF headquarters. 3 had congressional sponsors. 1 had a brother-in-law sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Patton was not just fighting corruption. He was fighting the infrastructure that corruption builds around itself to survive. And the first person who made that infrastructure visible walked into Patton's headquarters at 9 in the morning on February 17th wearing 2 stars and an expression of controlled outrage. Brigadier General Harold Fitch was the Deputy Chief of Logistics for the European Theater. He had not been summoned. He had arrived on his own initiative, which told Patton everything he needed to know about how quickly word had traveled through the networks that protected men like Peterson and Blackwell. Fitch sat down across from Patton without being invited to do so, and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "I've reviewed the arrest list," Fitch said. "Several of these officers are essential to ongoing supply operations. Removing them simultaneously creates a logistics gap that could compromise the spring offensive." Patton looked at the paper without touching it. "Tell me about the spring offensive, General. Tell me about the fuel requirements for the advance into Germany. And while you're doing that, tell me how those fuel requirements are going to be met by a supply chain where 40% of incoming materials are being sold to French civilians before they reach the front line." Fitch's expression did not change. "General Patton, I understand your frustration, but there are proper channels for investigating supply irregularities. What you've initiated is essentially a mass arrest of logistics personnel in the middle of active operations. The disruption alone could cost us—" "What it could cost us," Patton said, and his voice had gone to that particular quiet register that his staff had learned to interpret as maximum danger, "is fewer American soldiers dying from fuel shortages while their ambulances sit in snowdrifts. That's what it could cost us. General Fitch. Are you here to obstruct this investigation?" Fitch stood. "I'm here to advise you that this matter should be referred to theater headquarters for proper handling." "I'll note your advice," Patton said. "And I'll note that you arrived here without being summoned within 16 hours of the arrests. I'll also be asking the Inspector General whether your name appears anywhere in the financial records we seized last night. That's not an accusation. It's a standard investigative procedure. I assume you have no objection." Fitch left without responding. He did not contact Patton again. His name did not appear in the financial records, but 3 officers in his direct chain of command had accounts that did. The institutional protection was real, it was powerful, and it had just attempted to shut down the investigation before the first formal interview was complete. But Patton had anticipated exactly this move, and he had spent the hours between 3 in the morning and 9 making sure he had something that would make institutional interference impossible. Colonel James Worth. The Inspector General was 51 years old, had been an attorney in civilian life, and had a reputation in the Army that was succinctly summarized by a colleague who described him as the one man in this theater who genuinely cannot be bought, threatened, or reasoned with once he believes the law requires something. Worth had spent the pre-dawn hours reviewing the seized financial records and the Martinez notebook, and when he came to Patton that morning, he brought with him a legal assessment that changed everything. "If we charge only theft and corruption," Worth said, "the connections these men have can slow a prosecution for months. Reassignment's venue changes procedural challenges. These are experienced officers with access to legal counsel and political influence. But if we charge them with treason under the Articles of War, the jurisdiction is different, the timeline is compressed. The venue cannot be changed, and the political connections become irrelevant, because the charge carries the death penalty. No congressional sponsor wants to be seen publicly defending a man charged with treason during wartime." Patton looked at him. "Is the treason charge supportable?" Worth opened his folder. Blackwell sold morphine and sulfa drugs to German-adjacent civilian networks. Those drugs potentially reached German-controlled territory. Peterson's fuel sales demonstrably affected American military operations. The argument that this constitutes giving material aid and comfort to the enemy in a time of war is legally supportable. It is not a reach. It is what the facts describe. Patton nodded once. "File it." The treason charge changed the political calculation overnight. By February 19th, 2 of the 11 officers with Schaeff connections had already requested immunity arrangements. The Senate connection went silent, and in a development that Patton had not anticipated, but immediately recognized as the most important thing that had happened since the raid's 47 enlisted men working in supply depots across the Third Army's operational area walked forward voluntarily to give testimony. They had watched the arrests. They had seen that something was actually happening this time, that this was not going to be buried. And they came forward with evidence that had been accumulating for months in their own memories, their own quietly kept notes, their own careful observations of things they had reported and been told to forget. Thomas Martinez had not been alone. He had simply been the one who wrote it down. The others had been waiting for exactly what Martinez had been waiting for. Someone to care enough to do something. The formal investigation expanded to encompass 156 separate incidents of supply diversion across 6 months. Patton ordered that before court-martial proceedings began, every accused officer would be assigned to frontline combat duty for 1 week, not administrative positions behind the lines. Active frontline positions in foxholes, eating the same rations as combat troops, living in the same conditions, experiencing directly and physically the environment they had been stealing from. His JAG officers objected that this constituted pre-trial punishment. Patton said it was evidence gathering. The accused officers needed first-hand knowledge of frontline supply conditions in order to provide accurate testimony about those conditions. The order stood. Colonel Peterson arrived at his assigned frontline position on February 21st. He was issued K rations. The sergeant who received him said nothing beyond what military courtesy required. On the first day, Peterson ate his cold rations and said nothing. On the second day, the resupply convoy that was supposed to bring hot food did not arrive. Peterson asked when the next delivery was expected. The sergeant looked at him with an expression that contained no particular emotion and said, "When it gets here, sir. Sometimes tomorrow. Sometimes 3 days. Sometimes things get lost between the depot and the front line. I'm sure you wouldn't know anything about that." On the third day, a private from Tennessee named Billy Cooper took a bullet through the shoulder during a German probe at dawn. The medics arrived fast, but they were short on morphine, short on bandages, short on the specific supplies that would have made the difference between controlled pain and what was happening, which was a 20-year-old boy screaming in the snow while a medic apologized repeatedly and worked with what he had. Peterson watched from 15 feet away. He did not move. He did not speak. When the medics finally stabilized Cooper and began moving him toward evacuation, Peterson turned to the sergeant and said in a voice that the sergeant later described as the quietest human voice he had ever heard, "I did this. Some of those missing supplies. That was me." The sergeant looked at him for a long moment. "I know who you are, Colonel. General Patton made sure we knew before he sent you out here. Said you needed to see what you'd been stealing from." Peterson said nothing further for the remaining 4 days of his assignment. Major Blackwell came back from his week fundamentally different in a different way. He had watched a tank crew abandon their vehicle under fire because there was no fuel for extraction. He had heard a lieutenant radio back to headquarters, his voice entirely flat, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has stopped expecting the system to work. "Lost tank number 37. No fuel for extraction. Another supply shortage." And then the lieutenant had looked directly at Blackwell and said nothing because he didn't need to. The silence was the indictment. Blackwell returned from the front looking 10 years older. He had not broken the way Peterson had broken. He had broken differently through rage at himself that had nowhere to go except inward, and through the inescapable understanding that his precise, careful, profitable criminal enterprise had a human cost that his ledger had never recorded. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb came back unchanged. Webb had managed through some combination of psychological architecture and genuine belief in his own justifications to experience a week in the front line and return still convinced that what he had done was a natural consequence of war, rather than a betrayal of the men fighting it. Webb would become through his own defiance the instrument by which Patton made the entire investigation into a public event that reached American families in their living rooms. The courts-martial were scheduled to begin in early March. Patton ordered them conducted in a requisitioned French municipal hall, large enough to accommodate observers from every combat unit in the Third Army. He wanted frontline soldiers present. He wanted them to watch. And he wanted the military press in the room for every session. Webb's insistence on fighting every charge, his defense attorney's argument that the prosecution was selective enforcement targeting a scapegoat, rather than addressing systemic failure. His visible contempt for the proceedings was going to give the prosecution exactly the platform it needed to lay out in public in front of soldiers and journalists exactly what had been stolen from whom and what it had cost in American lives. The courts-martial were 3 days away. The testimony of 47 enlisted witnesses was cataloged and ready. The financial evidence was documented and prepared. Everything Patton needed to destroy the network publicly and permanently was in place. But on the evening of February 28th, a CID agent came to Patton's headquarters with a piece of information that nobody had anticipated. Martinez's notebook, the 60 pages of handwritten evidence that had confirmed and expanded the entire investigation, had been copied. Someone inside the JAG office had photographed every page, and the photographs had been sent through channels that took 6 hours to trace to a contact in Paris, who was connected to 3 of the officers currently awaiting court-martial. Someone had just tried to find out exactly what the prosecution knew, and that meant someone still had a plan to survive what was coming. The real battle was not in the foxholes. It was about to begin in a courtroom, and someone on the wrong side had just made their first move. In parts 1 and 2, Patton's simultaneous raids exposed a $3.8 million theft network spanning 3 countries, put 43 officers in custody, and forced the entire corrupt apparatus into the open. Martinez's notebook had cracked the case wide. The frontline week had broken Peterson and Blackwell psychologically. The treason charges had silenced the political protection. And then, on the eve of the courts-martial, someone inside the JAG office had photographed Martinez's 60 pages of evidence and sent the copies to a contact in Paris connected to 3 of the accused. Someone was preparing a defense. Someone still believed they could survive what was coming. And that act of desperation was about to hand Patton exactly the weapon he needed to make this trial not just a prosecution, but a public execution of everything the corruption represented. The photographs reached Paris on the night of February 28th. By midnight, CID agents had traced the chain back through 3 intermediaries to a civilian attorney operating out of an office near the Hotel Scribe, who had been retained through channels that required 6 hours to untangle by the legal representatives of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. The attorney had no military standing. He had no access to classified proceedings. What he had was a copy of the most comprehensive piece of evidence in the prosecution's case, and a plan to build a defense around anticipating every element of it before the trial began. Patton received the report at 0130 hours. He read it once, put it down, and said to Colonel Worth, "Who inside the JAG office?" Worth named a captain who had been assigned to the prosecution team for administrative coordination. He had photographed the notebook during a late evening working session when he was alone in the file room for 11 minutes. He had no prior connection to any of the accused officers. He had been approached 3 weeks earlier by an intermediary offering $4,000 in cash, which was more money than he would earn in 18 months of military service. "Charge him," Patton said. "Same charges as the others, and add it to Webb's file. Attempting to corrupt the prosecution is not a defense. It's an additional count." The captain was arrested before dawn. Webb's attorney in Paris received a visit from 2 MPs and a JAG colonel at 7 in the morning, and was informed that his retained materials were evidence in an active treason prosecution and would be surrendered immediately. The defense strategy had collapsed before the first witness was sworn. What happened next inside the German command structure was something Patton's intelligence officers had not anticipated, though, in retrospect, it was entirely logical. Word of the Third Army supply investigation had reached German intelligence through the civilian networks that Blackwell and others had been using for their black market operations. Those same French and Belgian intermediaries, who had been buying stolen American supplies, were also in several cases passing information in both directions. The Germans had known for months that American supply chains were being systematically looted. They had in fact factored that knowledge into their operational planning. German commanders in the sectors facing Third Army had calibrated their defensive positions and counterattack timing around the assumption that American frontline units would continue to experience the supply shortages that the corruption had been creating. When the raids happened and the network collapsed overnight, German intelligence reported a sudden and dramatic improvement in Third Army supply delivery rates. Frontline units that had been operating at 60% supply efficiency jumped to 93% within 10 days. Ammunition that had been rationed was suddenly available in full quantities. Fuel that had been stretched across operations was flowing at planned rates. The German commanders who had been exploiting those gaps found that the gaps had simply closed. 2 German divisional commanders in the sector submitted intelligence assessments in early March, noting that Third Army had abruptly become a different operational proposition than it had been in February, and recommending defensive redeployment to account for an enemy that could now actually sustain an offensive at full capacity. Those assessments were accurate. The courts-martial opened on March 4, 1945, in the requisitioned municipal hall of a French town 12 miles behind the front lines. Representatives from every combat unit in Third Army had been ordered to attend in rotation. The hall held 400 observers. Every session was filled. Military press correspondents occupied a designated section. The transcripts were released daily. Patton had wanted maximum publicity. He got it. Peterson's trial lasted 2 days. He had pleaded guilty to all charges, provided full cooperation, and his testimony alone was sufficient to convict 9 additional officers who had not yet entered pleas. When Peterson stood before sentencing and described watching Billy Cooper scream in the snow while a medic worked without morphine, the hall was silent enough to hear the wind outside. The court sentenced him to 15 years hard labor and dishonorable discharge. He was stripped of rank pension and every military honor he had earned in 22 years of service. He left the hall as prisoner number 4457. Blackwell's trial was more dramatic and more damning. The prosecution introduced the ledger. Every entry, every date, every quantity of morphine sulfa drugs and blood plasma sold to civilian networks, while American field hospitals ran short. Major Sarah Cohen, the JAG prosecutor, held the ledger up before the court and said that the defense's argument about systemic failure and individual scapegoating might have been persuasive if the defendant had been stealing cigarettes. He had been stealing medicine. The distinction was not legal. It was moral, and the court would decide what it meant. Blackwell was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years. Patton then invoked a provision of military law that assigned Blackwell to graves registration duty for 6 months before transfer to prison, recovering and burying American dead from recent battlefields. The men who might have lived if he had distributed the medicine he sold instead. Webb's trial became the defining event of the entire proceeding. He fought every charge. His defense argued selective prosecution, institutional failure, historical precedent, systemic inevitability. He was composed, articulate, and entirely unrepentant. The prosecution spent 3 days introducing evidence of witness intimidation, evidence destruction, and the attempted corruption of the prosecution team through the Paris attorney. The treason charge was argued with the full weight of the medical supply sales and the documented connection between those sales and German-adjacent civilian networks. The court convicted Webb on every count, including treason, sentenced him to 30 years hard labor, and Patton personally ordered that Webb's photograph and conviction be submitted to Stars and Stripes and to the civilian press wire. It ran in newspapers across America within a week. The letters went out in the 3rd week of March. Patton had ordered that every dollar recovered from the investigation, the seized cash, the frozen Swiss accounts, the liquidated proceeds from recovered stolen goods, be distributed to the families of soldiers killed or wounded while serving in Third Army during the period of the theft. Approximately $1.2 million was recovered and distributed. Each family received a check and a letter signed by Patton explaining that the money came from men who had stolen from their son, their husband, their father, and that those men had been prosecuted, convicted, and punished. The letters reached homes across America where families were already carrying the weight of loss in the specific way that wartime families carry it, which is quietly and without adequate support. What the letters added to that weight was something complicated. The knowledge that the death had not been only the result of enemy action, that Americans had betrayed Americans, that the system meant to protect their soldier had been corrupted from within, but also the knowledge that it had been found exposed and destroyed, that someone had held the men responsible, that justice had been done in their name. Newspapers described families weeping over the checks not because of the money, but because of what the letters said. Radio programs read the letters aloud. Editorial pages across the country wrote about what Patton had done, most of them in terms that made clear this was understood as something beyond a military corruption case. This was a story about accountability, about what institutions owe the people who serve them, about what happens when greed infects the machinery of war, and what it costs in human lives. By the end of March, black market activity in Third Army's operational area had dropped by 90%. Supply delivery rates to frontline units were running at 95% of planned capacity, the highest sustained rate of the entire campaign. The mathematical impossibility that had been hiding the theft for months was replaced by numbers that reflected an actual functioning supply chain. Private Danny Russo still in his foxhole. Though the foxhole had moved considerably closer to Germany by now, received his first full ration delivery in 6 weeks on March 9th. He had no way of knowing why the supplies had suddenly started arriving consistently. He didn't need to know why. He ate a hot meal for the first time in more than a month, and wrote a letter home to Brooklyn that his mother kept for the rest of her life. Thomas Martinez was promoted to sergeant and assigned to the Inspector General's office for the duration of the investigation. When the last court-martial concluded and his role was formally complete, Colonel Worth submitted a commendation describing his 8 months of solo evidence gathering as an act of moral courage under institutional pressure that had made the entire prosecution possible. Patton approved the commendation and added a personal note that Worth would later describe as the only time he ever saw Patton write something that wasn't an order or an assessment. It said that Martinez had demonstrated the most important quality in any soldier, which was the understanding that integrity is not what you maintain when it is easy, but what you maintain when it costs you something. 43 convictions. 117 dishonorable discharges among enlisted personnel. A supply system rebuilt from the ground up with mandatory audits, dual verification accounting, and penalties for irregularities that made future theft a proposition too dangerous to consider. The corruption that had been untouchable for months was gone. But the men who had built and maintained it were in military prisons, and the families of the men who had died from it had letters in their hands that said someone had cared enough to act. The story of what Patton did to the quartermasters who sold army rations on the black market was not the story of a battle. No ground was taken because of it. No enemy position was overrun. But 23 soldiers in a frozen ambulance had died or suffered because American officers chose profit over duty, and one general had decided that this was a battlefield too, and that it required the same totality of response as any other. There is one more chapter to this story that almost no history book records. What happened to Martinez after the war? What happened to the families who received those letters? And what happened to Patton himself in the months that followed in ways that connect directly to the character he revealed in this investigation? That chapter changes how you understand everything that came before it. And it begins with a question that nobody thought to ask at the time if Patton knew the supply chain was compromised for months before the February 14th convoy. What stopped him from acting sooner? The answer is not what you expect. And it is the most important part of this entire story. In 3 parts, we watched Patton dismantle a $3.8 million theft network operating inside his own army. We watched 43 officers arrested, tried, and convicted. We watched Thomas Martinez hand over 60 pages of handwritten evidence he had been carrying in his breast pocket for 8 months, while people with power threatened his career for noticing what they were doing. We watched Peterson break in a foxhole and Blackwell break in a different way, and Webb refused to break at all, right up until the moment the court read his sentence. The cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 asked a question that nobody thought to ask at the time if Patton knew the supply chain was compromised for months before February 14th. What stopped him from acting sooner? The answer to that question is the most important part of this story. And it begins with something that was discovered in Patton's personal papers 40 years after the war ended, in a manila envelope that had been misfiled in the Hoover Institution archives and sat unread until a graduate student opened it in 1987. Thomas Martinez was discharged from the United States Army in September 1945. He had served 2 additional months after the German surrender, helping the Inspector General's office close out the final paperwork on the supply theft prosecutions, ensuring that every conviction was properly documented and that the evidence chain for each case was preserved in a form that would survive any future appeals. Colonel Worth requested that Martinez be offered a permanent commission and a career in military law. Martinez declined. He went home to San Antonio, enrolled in accounting courses at Trinity University on the GI Bill, and spent the next 35 years working as an auditor for the city government, a job that required the same meticulous attention to discrepancies between what records showed and what reality contained that had led him to start his notebook in the first place. He never spoke publicly about his role in the investigation. When his daughter asked him once in the 1970s whether he had done anything important during the war, he thought about it for a moment and said that he had written some things down that needed to be written down, and that this had turned out to matter. He retired in 1981 and died in San Antonio in 1993 at the age of 71. His obituary mentioned his city service and his family. It did not mention the notebook. The Army's commendation from Colonel Worth and Patton's personal note about integrity costing something were found among his papers by his daughter after his death. She did not know what they referred to. She kept them because they were signed by people whose names she recognized from history books. Peterson served 4 years of his 15-year sentence before being paroled in 1949 on the condition that he make no public statements about his case and take no employment in any financial or administrative capacity for 10 years. He moved to a small town in Oregon, worked construction, and died in 1967. His family never spoke about what he had done. Blackwell served 11 years of his 25-year sentence, was released in 1956, and spent the remainder of his life in a way that several people who knew him described as a man who was waiting for something that never arrived, which is perhaps the most accurate description of what a conscience does to a person when it finally arrives too late. Webb served 6 years before his sentence was commuted, as part of a broader review of wartime military convictions in the early 1950s. He wrote a memoir that no publisher would accept. He died in 1971, still convinced as far as anyone could tell that history had treated him unfairly. The captain who photographed Martinez's notebook received a 3-year sentence, served 18 months, and became an insurance adjuster in Cincinnati. He never discussed the case publicly in his lifetime. The supply chain reforms that Patton implemented in Third Army in the spring of 1945 did not disappear with the end of the war. They became the foundation of a systematic revision of United States Army logistics oversight procedures that was formally adopted in 1947 and remained in effect in various updated forms for decades. The dual verification accounting system, the mandatory audit cycles, the separation of distribution authority from inventory authority that Worth had designed specifically to close the gaps that the black market network had exploited. These were institutional changes that outlasted every individual involved in their creation. When the Korean War began in 1950, American supply chains in theater operated under protocols derived directly from the Third Army reforms. When logistics officers in Vietnam documented significantly lower rates of supply diversion compared to historical averages in comparable conflicts, military historians who studied the numbers traced the lineage back through the procedural chain to Worth's 1945 redesign. The specific vulnerability that Peterson and Blackwell had exploited the gap between incoming inventory records and distribution receipts that existed because the same office controlled both was closed permanently by a procedural separation that a meticulous JAG colonel had designed in a requisitioned office in France, while 40 corrupt officers waited for their trials. The broader significance of what Patton did extends beyond the procedural. He made a decision that most commanders in his position would not have made, and understanding why requires understanding what he was actually risking. The officers he arrested had connections. The investigation he launched created a public scandal about corruption inside the American military in the middle of an active war. His own superiors at SHAEF were not uniformly supportive. There was a version of this story in which Patton receives pressure from above, accepts a quiet internal resolution that results in transfers and administrative reprimands rather than courts, martial and treason charges, and the network partially reconstitutes itself under new management within 6 months. That version was available to him. He chose a different version because he believed and stated explicitly in his orders and his correspondence from this period that an institution that protects its corrupt members to preserve its public image does more damage to itself than any external enemy can. The short-term embarrassment of public courts-martial and press coverage describing American officers selling morphine on the black market was in Patton's calculation worth less than the long-term damage of allowing soldiers to understand that the Army would not hold powerful men accountable for betraying powerless ones. He was right, and the evidence for his being right is the 90% drop in black market activity that followed the convictions and the sustained improvement in supply delivery that lasted through the end of the campaign. The question of what stopped Patton from acting sooner is the one that the manila envelope in the Hoover Institution archives answered in 1987. The graduate student who opened it found a series of handwritten notes in Patton's distinctive handwriting dated between November 1944 and February 1945. The notes documented his suspicions about supply chain irregularities, his preliminary inquiries, and the responses he received. They also documented something that had never appeared in any official record. In December 1944, Patton had received a direct communication from an officer at SHAEF headquarters, informing him that an investigation of Third Army supply personnel was not advisable at that time, because it would create political complications with certain congressional oversight relationships that were relevant to ongoing budget negotiations for the European campaign. The communication was not an order. It was advice. Patton had written in the margin, in the handwriting of a man recording something for his own reference, rather than for any audience. Noted, "Will proceed when I have evidence that cannot be buried." He was waiting just as Martinez had been waiting, not for permission, for evidence strong enough that burying it would cost more than using it. The February 14th convoy report, with its attached field hospital investigation already in the hands of officers who had no connection to the logistics command, was that evidence. Patton had been watching for it for 3 months. The detail that the graduate student found most striking, and that subsequent historians who examined the papers agreed, was the most significant element of the entire archive, was a single handwritten note dated February 13th, 1945, the day before the convoy incident. It read, "Supply irregularities in Sector 7, consistent with previous pattern. Estimated 35 to 40% diversion rate. Investigating officer at depot level has been transferred twice in 90 days. Source confirms systematic falsification of distribution records. Need incident with documentation that originates outside logistics chain. Cannot move without it." He had known. He had been building toward it. And when the ambulance ran out of fuel and a field hospital doctor wrote an incident report that moved through medical channels, rather than logistics channels, before anyone could intercept it. Patton had his incident with documentation that originated outside the logistics chain. He moved within hours. The investigation that looked like a reaction to a single tragedy was in fact the culmination of 3 months of careful preparation by a man who understood that timing and evidence were the weapons that would make this fight winnable rather than suppressible. Martinez had been keeping his notebook for 8 months. Patton had been keeping his for 3. Neither of them knew the other existed until the raids happened, and they were both suddenly on the same side of the same evidentiary case. From a 23-year-old supply clerk writing in a breast pocket notebook to a general with 3 months of margin notes waiting for the right moment. This story ultimately rests on a single proposition that the people most capable of exposing what is wrong with a system are usually the people who work closest to it, and that the most important thing an institution can do is create conditions in which those people believe their evidence will be used rather than buried. Patton created those conditions not by being unusually virtuous, but by being unusually strategic about the relationship between evidence timing and institutional power. He understood that corruption protects itself through procedure, and that defeating it required using procedure more aggressively than the corruption could respond to. 43 convictions. A supply system rebuilt on accountability, a 90% reduction in theft, and $1.2 million in recovered money sent to the families of soldiers who had been betrayed by the men, meant to support them with a letter explaining exactly what had happened and exactly what had been done about it. The letters mattered as much as the convictions, maybe more, because they told those families something that institutions rarely tell the people they fail. We know. We found it. We acted. And we wanted you to know. The measure of an institution is not whether it contains people willing to do wrong. It always will. The measure is whether it contains people willing to do what Martinez did for 8 months in silence, and whether it contains people willing to do what Patton spent 3 months preparing to do, and whether, when those two things finally connect, the institution has the integrity to let what follows happen in public rather than bury it for the sake of appearances. That is what this story is about. That is why it is worth telling. And that is why, 80 years later, a supply clerk from San Antonio, who never spoke publicly about any of it, deserves to have his name in the first sentence of the account, not the last.